There are moments when the world tilts on its axis, when the immutable laws that have governed kingdoms for centuries crumble at the sight of a single pair of defiant eyes. For Mira Veilheart, that moment came not in triumph or glory, but in the suffocating silence of a throne room where she was expected to kneel, and chose instead to stand. She had been born into a world that measured her worth by what she lacked. No wolf to call forth, no family name that mattered, no dowry to sweeten an unwanted marriage. The pack whispered that she was broken, defective, a mistake that nature had forgotten to correct. They were wrong about many things, but not about this. She was indeed broken, fractured by years of being told she was less than whole, shaped by the quiet violence of being unwanted. But broken things, Mira had learned, often had the sharpest edges. When the iron shackles closed around her wrists, and she was dragged before Alpha King Chaol Draven, a man carved from legend and brutality, whose very name made grown warriors tremble, she carried with her 19 years of swallowed pride and silent rebellion. She had nothing left to lose, which made her the most dangerous kind of woman, one with nothing left to fear. The ancient laws declared her the property of another. Sacred tradition demanded her submission. Political necessity required her silence. But when their eyes met across that vast throne room, his dark as winter storms, hers bright with the fury of the forgotten, something shifted in the very foundations of the kingdom. In that moment, neither law nor tradition nor necessity mattered. What mattered was the recognition that passed between two souls who had learned to survive in a world that had no place for them. She had come to the palace expecting to be sold like livestock. Instead, she found herself at the center of a storm that would either destroy them both or forge them into something the world had never seen before. Some stories begin with love, others with war. This one begins with the moment a king decided that some things were worth burning the world down for, and the woman who made him believe it was possible. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The iron shackles around Mira's wrists had long since stopped chafing. 3 days in the king's holding cells had taught her that fighting only made the metal bite deeper, leaving marks that would brand her as defiant even after her fate was decided. She kept her breathing steady, her back straight against the stone wall, and her eyes fixed on the thin shaft of light filtering through the barred window high above. They would come for her soon. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, heavy boots against wet stone, accompanied by the jangle of keys and the low murmur of male voices. Mira closed her eyes briefly, summoning what remained of her dignity. When the Alpha King's guards looked upon her, they would not see a broken woman. They would see Mira Veilheart, daughter of nothing, heir to nothing, but still standing. "Time to go, Wolfless," one of the guards sneered, as the cell door groaned open. Mira rose without assistance, though her legs trembled slightly from 3 days of poor food and little rest. The guard who had spoken, a thick-set man with scars across his jaw, gestured roughly toward the corridor. His Majesty doesn't like to be kept waiting. She walked between them in silence, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. The castle around her was a monument to power. Soaring ceilings painted with scenes of conquest, tapestries depicting the great wolf hunts of kings past, and everywhere the smell of dominance and territory that marked this place as belonging to the apex predator of their kind. Mira had never been inside the royal palace before today. Few from the outer territories ever were, unless they came bearing tribute or arrived in chains. She fell into the latter category. The great hall stretched before them like a cathedral built for war. Massive pillars carved from black stone reached toward a vaulted ceiling, while banners bearing the royal crest hung like blood-red wounds against the walls. At the far end, elevated on a dais of polished obsidian, sat the throne that every wolf in the kingdom feared and revered in equal measure. And upon that throne sat Alpha King Chaol Draven. Even from across the vast expanse of the hall, his presence pressed against Mira like a physical weight. She had heard the stories, as everyone had, how he had claimed his crown by killing his own father in single combat, how he could break a man's neck with his bare hands, how his wolf was so large and fierce that entire packs submitted without ever seeing him shift. But stories, she now realized, had not prepared her for the reality of him. He was beautiful in the way that sharp things were beautiful, dangerous, compelling. impossible to ignore. Dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that caught the light from the torches, and his eyes, even at this distance, seemed to burn with an inner fire that spoke of barely contained violence. His frame filled the throne with casual authority, broad shoulders encased in midnight blue velvet that somehow made him appear more threatening rather than less. "Kneel," commanded the guard beside her. Every other woman in the line of supplicants had already dropped to the floor, their heads bowed low in submission. Mira looked at them. Daughters of minor lords, merchants offering their prettiest slaves, brides selected by treaty and tradition, all of them waiting to be chosen or dismissed by the king's whim. But when Mira's turn came, something inside her rebelled against the command. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this was likely her last moment of agency, her final chance to choose anything for herself. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's voice, whispering fierce lullabies about wolves who ran free beneath open skies. Or perhaps it was simply the stubbornness that had kept her alive through 19 years of being unwanted. Instead of kneeling, she lifted her chin and met the Alpha King's gaze across the hall. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Conversations died. Guards shifted uncomfortably. The very air seemed to thicken with tension as every eye in the hall turned toward the small woman who dared defy the most basic protocol of royal audience. King Kael's expression didn't change, but Mira saw something flicker behind those dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. For a heartbeat that stretched like an eternity, they simply stared at each other across the vast distance of the hall. Then the moment shattered. "Insolent bitch!" snarled the guard, his hand moving to strike her. "Stop!" The king's voice cut through the hall like a blade, halting the guard's hand mid-swing. "Bring her forward." The walk to the throne felt like walking toward her own execution. Every step carried her closer to the man whose word could end her life with casual ease, whose power was absolute within these walls. But as Mira approached, she found herself studying his face with a strange sense of familiarity she couldn't name. There was something in his eyes, a depth of sadness that he kept carefully hidden behind layers of authority and controlled violence. It reminded her of the way she had learned to bury her own pain, the way she had taught herself to feel nothing when the pack children threw stones and called her defective, when her father's new wife suggested she might be happier living elsewhere, when Tobias Blackmere was chosen as her future mate without anyone bothering to ask her opinion. "Your name," the king said when she stood before his throne, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its quiet tone. "Mira Veilheart, your majesty." Veilheart. He seemed to consider the name, rolling it over his tongue as if tasting something familiar. "From the northern territories." "Yes, your majesty. And you were brought here because—" Lord Commander Garrett stepped forward, his voice crisp with military precision. "The Blackmere clan has requested formal transfer of the woman's marriage contract, your majesty. According to the ancient laws, any union that would create new territory claims must receive royal approval." Mira kept her face carefully blank, though inside she felt the last vestiges of hope crumble to ash. Of course, she should have known that even this final humiliation of being paraded before the king like livestock, was really about land and politics. The Blackmere clan wanted to absorb her family's small holding, and marrying the last Veilheart daughter was the cleanest way to do it. "I see." King Kael's gaze remained fixed on her face. "And what does the lady herself say to this arrangement?" The question caught everyone off guard, including Mira. In all her life, no one had ever asked what she wanted. Marriages were arranged by fathers and clan leaders, contracts signed by men who viewed women as assets to be traded. The idea that the Alpha King himself might care about her opinion seemed impossible. She began, then stopped, unsure how to voice thoughts she had never been allowed to speak aloud. "Speak freely," he said, and there was something in his tone that made it sound less like a royal command and more like a genuine invitation. Mira drew a breath and found her courage. "I would ask why my preference should matter, your majesty, when it has never mattered before." A smile ghosted across his lips. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Perhaps because I am asking. Then I would say—" She paused, knowing that her next words might seal her fate one way or another. "I would say that I have never met Tobias Blackmere, that he is 43 years old while I am 19, that he has buried 2 wives already, and that the only thing he wants from me is the deed to my family's lands." Her voice grew steadier with each word. "I would say that if given the choice, I would prefer to live as a servant in someone else's house than as a wife in his." The hall erupted in scandalized whispers. Lord Commander Garrett's face darkened with disapproval, while several of the noble ladies gasped audibly at such bold defiance. But King Cale only leaned back in his throne, his fingers steepled before him as he studied her with renewed interest. "Bold words from a wolfless woman," he said finally. The cruel reminder of her defect sent heat rushing to Mira's cheeks, but she refused to lower her eyes. "Truth is truth, Your Majesty, regardless of who speaks it." "Indeed it is." He stood then, rising from his throne with fluid grace that spoke of lethal power held in check. As he descended the steps toward her, Mira became acutely aware of his size, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, broad enough that his presence seemed to fill her entire field of vision. When he stopped before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the scent of cedar and winter wind that clung to his skin, he spoke in a voice meant only for her ears. "Tell me, Mira Veilheart, what would you choose if choice were truly yours to make?" The question hit her like a blow to the chest. What would she choose? Freedom, perhaps, though she had never tasted it and wasn't sure she would recognize it. Safety, though she had learned not to expect it. Love, though she had never seen an example of it that didn't come wrapped in conditions and demands. "I would choose," she began, then stopped, realizing the truth of it even as the words formed in her mind. "I would choose not to choose, Your Majesty. I would choose to find out who I am when no one else is deciding for me." Something shifted in his expression then, a crack appearing in the careful mask of royal indifference. For just a moment, she saw past the crown and the power to the man beneath, and what she saw there was a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache with recognition. "Your Majesty," Lord Commander Garrett interrupted, his voice tight with barely concealed impatience. "The Blackmere delegation awaits your decision. The marriage contract will not be approved," King Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Mira felt her knees nearly buckle with relief and terror in equal measure. "Furthermore," the king continued, turning to address the hall at large, "I declare Mira Veilheart to be under royal protection, exempt from any marriage contract not of her own choosing." Lord Commander Garrett's face went pale. "Your Majesty, with respect, the ancient laws clearly state—" "The laws state what I say they state," King Cale replied, his tone deadly quiet, "and I am rewriting them as of this moment." He turned back to Mira, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been tenderness. "You will remain here, in the palace, under my personal protection. No one will force you into marriage. No one will harm you. This I swear on my crown and my blood." Mira stared up at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "But why, Your Majesty? Why would you do this for me?" King Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if looking for something he had lost. When he finally spoke, his words were soft enough that only she could hear them. "Because someone should have asked you what you wanted long ago. Because you have the courage to speak truth to kings. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words he wasn't sure he should say. "Because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it means to be caged by other people's expectations." Before Mira could respond, he stepped back and addressed the hall once more. "The audience is concluded. Lady Veilheart will be escorted to appropriate quarters." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with shocked whispers and speculative glances, Mira found herself surrounded by royal guards, but not as a prisoner this time. These guards formed a protective circle around her, their hands resting on their sword hilts as they watched the dispersing nobles with wary eyes. She looked back once as they led her from the hall, searching for another glimpse of the king who had just turned her world upside down. She found him still standing before his throne, watching her departure with an expression she couldn't read. But what struck her most was not his power or his beauty, or even his unexpected mercy. It was the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious he had thought lost forever. The chambers they gave her were grander than any place Mira had ever imagined living. Tapestries in deep blues and silver adorned the walls, depicting scenes of wolves running beneath star-filled skies. A fire crackled warmly in an ornate hearth, casting dancing shadows across furniture that looked as though it had been crafted for nobility. The bed alone was larger than the entire room she had shared with her stepsisters back home, but luxury could not quiet the storm of questions raging in her mind. Why had the Alpha King protected her? What did he gain from defying ancient laws for a wolfless nobody from the Northern Territories? And most disturbing of all, why had she felt that strange moment of recognition when their eyes met across the throne room, as if she had been waiting her entire life to see his face? Lady Sarah Nightingale, the stern-faced woman who had been assigned as her attendant, bustled about the room with practiced efficiency. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her dress was the deep green of court attendants, expensive enough to reflect the royal household status, but somber enough to ensure she would never outshine the ladies she served. "You'll take your meals in the small dining hall with the other ladies of the court," Lady Sarah was saying as she arranged bottles of expensive perfumes and oils on the dressing table. "Though I suspect you'll find their conversation rather different from what you're accustomed to." Mira touched one of the silk gowns that had been provided, marveling at its softness. The fabric was the color of deep wine, with intricate embroidery along the bodice that must have taken months to complete. At home, such a dress would have been worth more than her family's entire annual income. Different how? Lady Sarah paused in her arrangement of jewelry, choosing her words carefully. The ladies here concern themselves primarily with fashion, gossip, and securing advantageous marriages. They've never worked with their hands, never worried about where their next meal would come from, never, she gestured vaguely at Mira, never been forced to develop the kind of strength you clearly possess. You speak as though you know something about that kind of strength yourself. A shadow crossed Lady Sarah's weathered features. I was not always a lady of the court. Once I was very much like you, alone, unwanted, surviving on stubborn will and little else. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from one of the gowns, her movements betraying a nervous energy that seemed at odds with her composed exterior. His Majesty has a particular gift for recognizing those who have been discarded by others. Mira studied the older woman's profile, noting the faint scars along her knuckles that spoke of hard labor, the way she held herself with careful dignity that suggested it had been hard-won. "How long have you served in the palace?" 12 years this autumn. Lady Sarah's voice softened slightly. "I was a widow with 3 children and nowhere to go when bandits burned our village. The king found us on the road, half-starved and desperate. He brought us here, gave us work, gave us purpose." She turned to meet Mira's gaze directly. "My children are grown now, well-educated, with positions of their own. That is what royal protection can mean, if you're wise enough to accept it gracefully." Before Mira could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber. Lady Sarah opened the door to reveal a young man in royal livery, his face flushed with exertion, and his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but His Majesty requests Lady Veilheart's presence in his private study, immediately." Mira's stomach lurched. "Did he say why?" The messenger shook his head, though his eager expression suggested he had theories. "Only that you should come at once, and that you're to bring nothing with you." Lady Sarah's expression grew deeply troubled. "I'll escort you," she said, reaching for a heavy cloak. "The king's private study is not a place where unmarried ladies typically venture, particularly not alone." "Has he ever summoned a woman there before?" Mira asked as they hurried through the corridors. "Not in all the years I've served here." Lady Sarah's voice was grim. "The king keeps his private chambers strictly separate from court business. Whatever he wants to discuss with you, it's not a matter for public ears." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels, and portraits of long-dead kings whose painted eyes seemed to follow their movement. The palace at night was a different creature than it had been during the day. Shadows pooled in corners like living things, and the few servants they passed moved with hushed efficiency that spoke of a household accustomed to keeping royal secrets. With each step, Mira felt the weight of her decision to defy tradition settling more heavily on her shoulders. She had asked for choice, for freedom, but what if the price was higher than she could pay? What if the king's protection came with expectations she wasn't prepared to meet? The private study was smaller and more intimate than she had expected, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, and lit by a dozen candles that cast warm light across worn Persian rugs. Maps covered one entire wall, marked with colored pins and notations in what she assumed was the king's own hand. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with correspondence, reports, and what appeared to be architectural drawings for some kind of construction project. King Kale stood with his back to them, staring out a tall window that offered a view of the palace gardens below. He had changed from his formal court attire into simpler clothes, dark trousers, and a white shirt that revealed the powerful lines of his shoulders and arms. Even in casual dress, he radiated an authority that seemed to bend the very air around him to his will. "Thank you, Lady Sarah," he said without turning. "Please wait outside." Lady Sarah hesitated, her protective instincts clearly warring with her respect for royal commands. "Your Majesty, propriety suggests—" "I am rewriting the rules of propriety as well, it seems," he replied with dry humor. "Wait outside, but remain close. I suspect Lady Veilheart's reputation will need all the protection it can get after today." When they were alone, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain they should cross. Mira found herself studying the room more carefully, taking in details that spoke of a man far more complex than the ruthless king of legend. The books ranged from military strategy to philosophy to what appeared to be poetry. A chess set sat on a side table, the pieces arranged in the middle of a game, though whether he played against himself or had a regular opponent, she couldn't tell. "You sent for me, Your Majesty?" He turned then, and she was struck again by the intensity of his gaze. In the candlelight, the harsh lines of his face seemed somehow softer, more human. She could see the exhaustion that lined his eyes, the weight of responsibility that seemed to press down on his broad shoulders. "I received several interesting visitors shortly after court concluded." He moved to a sideboard and poured himself a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "The first was Tobias Blackmere, as I'm sure you've guessed." Mira's chest tightened. "And what did he want?" "To inform me that my decision was legally questionable, politically dangerous, and personally insulting." Kincaid took a sip of his drink, watching her reaction carefully. "He also suggested that my interest in you might be less than honorable, and that the noble houses would not stand for such flagrant disregard of established law." Heat flooded Mira's cheeks. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that if he ever spoke of you with such disrespect again, I would have his tongue cut out and fed to my hounds." The casual way he delivered the threat made it all the more chilling. I also reminded him that questioning the king's decisions could be considered treason, and that I've had men executed for less serious offenses. Mira sank into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, suddenly feeling the full weight of what had transpired. "You've made a powerful enemy for my sake." "I've made an enemy because he needed making." Kincaid settled into the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the faint scars that marked his hands, evidence of a life spent fighting for everything he possessed. Blackmere has grown too comfortable in his power, too confident that his wealth makes him untouchable. It was past time someone reminded him otherwise. But there will be consequences. "Oh, undoubtedly." His smile held no warmth. "Which brings me to my second visitor, Lord Marcus Ashwood, who came to inform me that several of the noble houses are concerned about the precedent I've set today. They worry that other marriages might be called into question, that the careful alliances they've spent years building might unravel if women suddenly believe they have the right to refuse unwanted matches." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shifting shadows across the king's face as Mira absorbed his words. "What did you tell Lord Ashwood?" "That their concerns are noted but irrelevant. That I am still king, and that my word is still law." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense. "But what I want to know, Mira, is whether you understand what you've chosen." She looked up at him, confused. "What I've chosen, by refusing to kneel in the throne room, by speaking honestly about your circumstances, by accepting my protection. You've chosen to step outside the rules that govern women of your station." He set down his glass and studied her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "There will be those who see you as a threat to the natural order, others who will assume you've gained my favor through unconventional means, and still others who will test you, hoping to prove you unworthy of the protection I've granted." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She thought of the curious glances from the servants, the whispered conversations that had followed her through the corridors, the way even Lady Sarah had seemed surprised by the king's unprecedented decision. "What kind of tests?" she asked finally. Kincaid's expression grew grim. "The kind designed to break you. Social humiliation, deliberate exclusion, perhaps even physical threats if they grow bold enough. The court is not a kind place to those who don't understand its rules, and it's especially cruel to those who dare to change them." Mira thought of her stepsisters, who had spent years devising small cruelties designed to remind her of her place. She thought of the pack children who had thrown stones and called her defective, of the adults who had spoken about her as if she weren't there. She had survived all of that. Surely she could survive whatever the noble ladies of the court might devise. "Then teach me the rules," she said firmly. The request seemed to surprise him. He picked up his glass again, turning it slowly in his hands as he studied her face. "Why?" "Because I refuse to be broken." The words came out stronger than she felt, but once spoken, she found truth in them. "You've given me something I never thought I could have. Choice. I won't waste it by cowering in these chambers, no matter how beautiful they are." For a long moment, King Kale simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, something that might have been admiration flickered in his eyes. "Very well," he said at last. "But understand this. If you truly want to survive here, to thrive here, you must be willing to become something more than you were. The woman who walked into my throne room today has courage, but courage alone will not be enough. You must learn to be cunning, ruthless when necessary, and above all, unbreakable." Mira straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze directly. "Then teach me to be unbreakable." King Kale rose and moved to his desk, pulling out a leather-bound journal and a quill. "We'll start with the most dangerous inhabitants of this palace, the noble ladies who will seek to destroy you with smiles on their faces." He began writing, his pen moving in swift, precise strokes. "Lady Catherine Ashford controls the social calendar and decides which events you'll be invited to attend. Cross her, and you'll find yourself completely isolated. Lady Helena Ravencrest has influence over matters of court fashion and etiquette. Her disapproval can ruin a woman's reputation overnight. And Lady Victoria Queensberry—" He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "Lady Victoria believes she should be queen and will see you as competition, regardless of your actual intentions." "Competition?" Mira laughed, though it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I'm wolfless. I have no family connections, no dowry, no political value whatsoever. How could anyone see me as competition?" King Kyle set down his quill and looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. "You truly don't understand, do you?" "Understand what?" "What happened in the throne room today. What it meant." He stood and walked back to the window, his shoulders tense with something that looked like regret. "In 32 years of life, I have never publicly contradicted the ancient laws. I have never declared a woman under royal protection. I have never—" He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "I have never looked at a woman the way I looked at you today." Mira's breath caught in her throat. "Your Majesty—" "Every person in that hall saw it, Mira. The way I watched you, the way I listened to your words as though they mattered more than law or tradition. The way I—" He turned back to face her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression that made her chest ache. "The way I couldn't seem to look away from you." The admission hung between them like a confession, dangerous and impossible to take back. Mira felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the implications crashed over her. She had asked for choice, for freedom, but she was beginning to understand that what the king had given her was far more complicated than either of those things. "I never asked for that," she whispered. "I know." His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but it happened nonetheless, and now we both must live with the consequences. Which brings me to my third visitor tonight. A chill ran down Mira's spine at the change in his tone. "There was a third visitor?" King Kale returned to his chair, but instead of sitting, he remained standing, his hands braced against the back as if he needed the support. "Lady Victoria Queensberry. She came to express her concern about the precedent I had set, and to offer her services in helping to resolve the situation diplomatically." "What kind of services?" "She suggested that if I was determined to protect you from an unwanted marriage, perhaps I should consider arranging a more suitable match. Someone who would appreciate the honor of marrying under royal auspices, who could provide you with status and security without the complications that might arise from keeping you here indefinitely." Mira felt cold despite the warmth of the fire. "And did you tell her that the whole point was to give me the choice to refuse marriage entirely?" "I did, which is when she made her true feelings known." His expression darkened. "She informed me that a wolfless woman with questionable origins had no business refusing matches with respectable men, that my protection was being wasted on someone who would never be able to repay such generosity appropriately, and that perhaps my judgment was being clouded by factors that had nothing to do with justice or mercy." The insult hit Mira like a physical blow, but what stung worse was the kernel of truth within it. She was wolfless, from a minor family with no political connections. What could she possibly offer a king that would justify the risks he was taking on her behalf? "Maybe she has a point," Mira said quietly. "Maybe you would be better served by finding me a husband and putting this whole situation behind you. Is that what you want?" The question was sharp, almost accusatory. "What I want doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters." He moved away from the chair and came to kneel in front of her, bringing their faces level. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that Mira forgot to breathe. "Do you understand nothing of what I've tried to tell you? For the first time in my life, I've met someone whose wants and needs aren't secondary to political necessity. Don't you dare tell me they don't matter." She stared into his dark eyes, seeing the intensity burning there like banked coals. "But why? Why me? I'm nothing special, nothing remarkable. I'm exactly what Lady Victoria said. A wolfless woman with questionable origins who can't possibly repay such generosity. You want to know why?" His voice was rough, almost angry. "Because when you looked at me across that throne room, you saw me. Not the crown, not the power, not the fear that everyone else sees. You saw me. And when I told you to kneel, you chose not to. Not out of disrespect, but because something inside you refused to be diminished. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How long I've waited to meet someone who wouldn't flinch away from the truth of who I am?" The rawness in his voice shook something loose inside her chest. "And who are you, Your Majesty? Truly?" King Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if looking for some sign that she could handle the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I am a man who killed his own father to claim a throne I never wanted. I am a king who rules through fear because I learned long ago that love is a weakness enemies will exploit. I am someone who has never had a conversation about anything that mattered without calculating its political ramifications." He paused, his jaw working as if the next words were physically difficult to speak. "And I am someone who has been alone for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to want something that couldn't be taken by force or purchased with gold." The confession hit Mira like a blow to the chest. She saw past the crown and the power to the man beneath, and what she saw there was a loneliness so profound it made her own isolation seem trivial by comparison. "What is it you want?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the room, followed immediately by Lady Sarah's voice, tight with urgency. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but Lord Commander Garrett requires your immediate presence. There's been an incident." King Kale's expression changed instantly, the vulnerable man disappearing as the ruler took his place. He rose smoothly to his feet, his jaw hardening and his shoulders squaring with familiar authority. "What kind of incident?" "A delegation from the Moonstone Pack has arrived unexpectedly. They're demanding an audience, and they've brought armed escorts. The commander feels it would be wise for you to meet with them immediately." Mira watched as the transformation completed itself, fascinated and saddened by how quickly he could bury the man she had glimpsed beneath the king's mask. When he looked at her again, it was with the controlled intensity of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions in a matter of moments. "This conversation isn't finished," he told her quietly, "but it will have to wait. Lady Sarah will escort you back to your chambers, and you will remain there until further notice. What about tomorrow? You said you would teach me, and I will." His hand touched her arm briefly, the contact warm and reassuring despite the circumstances. "Tomorrow we begin your real education. But tonight, you stay safe behind locked doors while I deal with whatever crisis the Moonstone Pack has brought to my doorstep." He moved toward the door, then stopped, looking back at her with an expression that was equal parts regret and determination. "Be careful, Mira. The game has just become far more dangerous than either of us anticipated." Then he was gone, leaving Mira alone with Lady Sarah, and 1,000 questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. As they walked back through the shadowed corridors, past the painted kings in silent armor, Lady Sarah remained unusually quiet. It wasn't until they reached Mira's chambers that the older woman finally spoke. "In all my years of service," she said softly, "I have never seen His Majesty look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." Mira paused with her hand on the door. "Is that a good thing or a terrible thing?" Lady Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "I suppose that depends on whether you're brave enough to love a man who has forgotten how to be loved in return." Behind them, the sound of boots on stone echoed through the halls as guards rushed to answer their king's summons. Somewhere in the palace, dangerous men were making dangerous demands. And at the center of it all was a wolfless woman who had somehow become the most protected and most vulnerable person in the entire kingdom. The game, as the king had said, was just beginning. But as Mira settled into her luxurious chambers and tried to make sense of everything that had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had already lost something precious, the simple certainty of knowing where she belonged. Now she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, caught between the life she had left behind and a future she couldn't begin to imagine. And at the heart of that uncertain future stood a king who looked at her as if she held the key to something he had thought lost forever. Dawn came too early, accompanied by the sound of urgent voices in the corridor outside Mira's chambers. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with dark eyes and whispered confessions, with the memory of a king kneeling before her, as if she were something precious rather than broken. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the tall windows, reality crashed back over her like a cold wave. The Moonstone Pack. Whatever they had wanted, it had been serious enough to tear the king away from their conversation and keep him occupied through the night. Mira pressed her ear to the door, trying to make sense of the hurried footsteps and muffled conversations that seemed to fill the palace corridors. A soft knock interrupted her eavesdropping. "Lady Veilheart? It's Lady Sarah. May I come in?" Mira opened the door to find her attendant looking unusually haggard, her typically perfect appearance marred by signs of a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually immaculate hair showed evidence of hasty arrangement. "What's happened?" Mira asked immediately. Lady Sarah entered the room and closed the door firmly behind her, then moved to check that the windows were properly latched, a precaution that sent alarm bells ringing in Mira's mind. The Moonstone Pack brought troubling news, Lady Sarah said quietly, as she began laying out clothes for the day. There have been attacks on several border settlements. Villages burned, families displaced. The pack elders are demanding immediate military response. Mira felt her stomach clench. Attacks by whom? No one knows for certain. The survivors speak of wolves, but wolves that moved with human intelligence, that seemed to target specific buildings and people rather than simply hunting for food. Lady Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she arranged a deep green dress across the bed. His Majesty has been in emergency council all night. The implications hit Mira like a physical blow. Organized attacks on border settlements could mean only one thing. Either rogue packs were testing the kingdom's defenses, or worse, a coordinated rebellion was beginning. Either way, it spelled disaster for a kingdom already destabilized by the king's unprecedented defiance of ancient law. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough that Lord Commander Garrett has already dispatched 3 companies of soldiers to investigate and secure the affected areas. Bad enough that the king hasn't left the war room since midnight." Lady Sarah met Mira's eyes in the mirror above the dressing table. "And bad enough that certain members of the court are already suggesting that yesterday's disruption of tradition may have been seen as a sign of weakness by our enemies." The words hit Mira like a slap. "They're blaming me. They're looking for someone to blame, which amounts to the same thing." Lady Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Lord Ashwood made his feelings quite clear during this morning's emergency session. He believes that the king's decision to overturn established marriage law has sent a message that the crown is no longer committed to maintaining order." Mira sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of guilt settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. She had asked for freedom, for choice, and the price might be measured in burned villages and displaced families. "I should go to him," she said, rising again with sudden determination. "I should tell him that I've changed my mind, that I'll marry Tobias Blackmere after all." "Absolutely not." Lady Sarah's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. "Do you think so little of your king that you believe him incapable of fighting multiple battles at once? Do you imagine he would thank you for throwing away the very thing he risked so much to give you?" The rebuke stung because it carried truth. Mira had spent so many years believing herself to be a burden that her first instinct was still to minimize the disruption she caused, even at the cost of her own well-being. "Then what do I do?" she asked. "How do I help?" "You learn." Lady Sarah moved to the wardrobe and began selecting accessories with practiced efficiency. "You become the woman worthy of the protection you've been given, and you prove to everyone watching that the king's faith in you was not misplaced." A sharp rap on the door interrupted them. Lady Sarah opened it to reveal a young page, his face flushed with exertion and importance. "Begging your pardon, Lady Valhart, but you're requested in the blue drawing room." Immediately, Mira's heart lurched. By whom? The page's expression grew uncertain. "By Lady Victoria Queensberry, my lady. She said to tell you that your education in court protocol begins now." Lady Sarah muttered something under her breath that sounded distinctly unflattering to Lady Victoria's parentage. Of course she did. The vultures are already circling. 20 minutes later, Mira found herself standing outside the blue drawing room, dressed in the deep green gown, and feeling like a soldier about to march into battle without weapons or armor. Lady Sarah had wanted to accompany her, but the page had made it clear that Lady Victoria expected to meet with Mira alone. "Remember," Lady Sarah had whispered as they approached the door, "she wants you to fail. Don't give her the satisfaction." The blue drawing room was aptly named. Everything from the silk wallpaper to the delicate porcelain was rendered in various shades of azure and cobalt. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a space that might have been beautiful if not for the woman who dominated it like a spider in the center of its web. Lady Victoria Queensberry was perhaps the most striking woman Mira had ever seen. Tall and elegant, with platinum blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, and a figure that showed to perfect advantage in her midnight blue gown. She possessed the kind of classical beauty that graced ancient statues and royal portraits. But there was something cold in her pale eyes, something calculating in her perfect smile that made Mira's skin crawl. "Lady Valhart," she said, rising from a delicate chair with fluid grace. "How lovely to finally meet you properly. Please, sit. We have so much to discuss." Mira approached cautiously, choosing a chair that put her back to the wall and allowed her to keep the door in her peripheral vision. Lady Victoria's smile widened, as if she found Mira's wariness amusing. "Tea?" she asked, gesturing to an elaborate service set on the table between them. "Thank you." Lady Victoria poured with practiced elegance, her movements precise and economical. "I must say you've caused quite a stir in our little community. The servants can speak of nothing else, and the ladies are positively buzzing with curiosity about the mysterious woman who captured our king's attention so completely." The words were delivered with perfect courtesy, but Mira caught the edge beneath them. "I didn't seek his attention, Lady Queensberry. I was brought here under circumstances beyond my control." "Oh, my dear child, we all know that." Lady Victoria settled back in her chair, cradling her teacup with delicate fingers. "The question is what you intend to do with the opportunity you've been given." Mira took a careful sip of tea, using the moment to study her opponent's face. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Of course you don't. How could you? You've lived your entire life in provincial obscurity, never learning the subtle arts that govern civilized society." Lady Victoria's tone was patronizingly sympathetic. "But that's precisely why I've taken it upon myself to offer guidance. Consider me your mentor in the ways of the court." The offer sounded reasonable, even generous, but every instinct Mira possessed was screaming warnings. "That's very kind of you. Kindness has nothing to do with it. Simple practicality does." Lady Victoria leaned forward slightly, her pale eyes intense. "You see, my dear, His Majesty's decision yesterday has created a very delicate situation. The noble houses are watching to see how you conduct yourself, whether you prove worthy of the unprecedented protection you've been granted." "And if I don't prove worthy?" Lady Victoria's smile turned predatory. "Then I'm afraid the king will be forced to reconsider his position. After all, even a monarch cannot afford to appear foolish in the eyes of his subjects." The threat was delivered so smoothly, wrapped in such concern, that it took Mira a moment to recognize it for what it was. But once she did, anger began to build in her chest like a slow burning fire. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lady Queensberry?" "I'm suggesting that you allow me to help you navigate these treacherous waters. Accept my guidance, follow my advice, and I'll ensure that you're presented to the court in the most favorable light possible." Lady Victoria's voice dropped to a confidential whisper. "Refuse, and I'm afraid you'll find yourself quite isolated indeed. The ladies of the court can be terribly cruel to those they perceive as upstarts or threats." There it was, the choice between submission and destruction, presented with a smile, and wrapped in false concern. Mira set down her teacup with deliberate care, meeting Lady Victoria's gaze directly. "And what would your guidance entail?" "Oh, the usual things. Proper deportment, appropriate conversation, suitable attire for various occasions. Most importantly, learning when to speak and when to remain silent." Lady Victoria's smile never wavered. "For instance, It would be highly inappropriate for someone in your position to monopolize the king's attention, or to presume upon his generosity beyond what is strictly necessary. I see. Mira felt a strange calm settling over her, the same sensation she had experienced in the throne room when she chose not to kneel. And who decides what is strictly necessary? Why, those of us who understand the delicate balance of court life, naturally. Those who have the king's best interests at heart. The presumption was breathtaking, but Mira kept her expression neutral. How fortunate for me that you're willing to share such wisdom. Lady Victoria either missed the subtle sarcasm or chose to ignore it. I'm so pleased you understand. Now, shall we begin with the most pressing matter? There's to be a formal dinner tonight, a gathering of the most influential families to discuss the current unpleasantness at our borders. As the king's ward, you'll naturally be expected to attend. Ward. The word hit Mira like a slap, reducing her from a woman under royal protection to something closer to a charity case. She was certain the choice of terminology was deliberate. Of course, she said evenly. I wouldn't want to disappoint His Majesty. Excellent. Now, the key to success at such gatherings is to remember your place. Smile, look pleasant, but don't presume to join conversations unless directly addressed. And if you are addressed, keep your responses brief and deferential. The last thing anyone wants is for you to accidentally say something that might be construed as inappropriate. With each word, Lady Victoria's true intentions became clearer. She didn't want to guide Mira through court society. She wanted to render her invisible, to reduce her to a silent, decorative presence that posed no threat to the established order. What sort of topics should I avoid? Mira asked, her voice carefully neutral. Oh, politics certainly. Military matters. Anything to do with pack alliances or marriage negotiations. Best to stick to safe subjects. The weather, perhaps, or compliments on the other ladies' gowns. Lady Victoria's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. In fact, it might be wise for you to spend most of the evening simply observing. There's so much you could learn just by watching how proper ladies conduct themselves. The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mira found herself thinking of the king's words from the night before. You must learn to be cunning, ruthless when necessary, and above all, unbreakable. That sounds like excellent advice, she said, rising from her chair with deliberate grace. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom, Lady Queensberry. I'm sure tonight will be most educational. Something flickered in Lady Victoria's pale eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first stirrings of suspicion. But her smile remained perfect as she rose as well, extending her hand in farewell. Until tonight, then, dear. I do so look forward to seeing how you manage. Mira curtsied precisely as Lady Sarah had taught her, then made her way to the door with measured steps. But as she reached for the handle, Lady Victoria's voice stopped her. Oh, and Lady Veilheart, a word of advice from one woman to another. Kings are fickle creatures, and their attention rarely lasts long. It would be unfortunate if you were to mistake temporary protection for something more permanent. Mira turned back slowly, meeting Lady Victoria's gaze with steel in her own dark eyes. Thank you for the warning, Lady Queensberry. I'll be sure to keep it in mind. As she left the blue drawing room and walked back through the palace corridors, Mira felt something shifting inside her chest, a hardening, a crystallization of purpose that she had never experienced before. Lady Victoria had made a mistake in revealing her hand so clearly. She had shown Mira exactly what she was up against, and more importantly, she had given her a clear enemy to focus on. The game, as the king had said, was just beginning, but Mira was no longer content to be a passive piece on the board. If Lady Victoria wanted a battle, she would get one. That evening, Mira stood before the mirror in her chambers as Lady Sarah put the finishing touches on her appearance. The gown they had chosen was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that seemed to shift and shimmer in the candlelight. Its cut elegant without being ostentatious. Its color chosen to complement her dark hair and pale skin. Lady Sarah had arranged her hair in an intricate style that managed to be both sophisticated and approachable, with small sapphire pins that caught the light like captured stars. Remember, Lady Sarah said, as she made final adjustments to the drape of the gown, you are not Lady Victoria's ward or charity case. You are a woman under royal protection, which makes you the equal of any person in that room. Let them see that in how you carry yourself. Mira nodded, studying her reflection with critical eyes. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had stood in shackles just 24 hours ago. This woman looked like she belonged in a palace, like she had been born to wear silk and jewels. What if I make a mistake? What if I say the wrong thing? Then you recover gracefully and continue. The worst thing you can do is show fear or uncertainty. Lady Sarah's voice was firm. These people are predators, and they can sense weakness from across a room, but they also respect strength, even when they resent it. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Mira's escort. Not a servant this time, but a young lord whose presence spoke of the king's determination to ensure she was treated with appropriate respect. Lord Jonathan Blackwood was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and an easy smile that put her immediately at ease. Lady Veilheart, he said with a respectful bow. His Majesty has asked me to escort you to dinner. May I say you look absolutely radiant this evening? The compliment was clearly genuine, and Mira found herself smiling in response. Thank you, Lord Blackwood. You're very kind. Not kind, merely honest. He offered his arm with natural courtesy. Shall we? The walk to the formal dining room took them through the most magnificent parts of the palace, past galleries lined with priceless artwork, and halls decorated with the treasures of conquered kingdoms. But Mira found her attention focused less on the splendor around her than on the man beside her. Tell me honestly, she said quietly as they approached the dining room. What am I walking into? Lord Blackwood's expression grew thoughtful. A gathering of people who are very good at hiding their true thoughts behind pleasant faces. They'll smile at you, compliment your gown, ask polite questions about your family, and all the while, they'll be evaluating you like generals studying an enemy fortification. Wonderful, Mira muttered. Don't let them intimidate you. You have something they don't, the king's genuine interest. That makes you more powerful than you realize, even if you don't understand how to wield that power yet. Before Mira could ask what he meant, they reached the entrance to the formal dining room. The doors opened to reveal a scene of breathtaking opulence. A table long enough to seat 40 people, set with crystal and silver that caught the light from 3 massive chandeliers. The guests were already assembled, the men resplendent in their formal court attire, the women glittering like jeweled birds in gowns worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. And at the head of the table, commanding the room's attention even while seated, was the king. Mira's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. He wore midnight blue velvet that matched her own gown, though she was certain the coordination was coincidental. His dark hair was perfectly arranged, and the formal attire only emphasized the dangerous elegance that made him so compelling. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. When their gazes met across the room, she saw something there that made her heart race with recognition, relief, gratitude, and beneath those, something deeper and more complex that she didn't dare name. Lady Veilheart, he said, rising from his chair as Lord Blackwood escorted her into the room. The gesture was unprecedented. Kings did not rise for anyone below royal rank, but the message it sent was unmistakable. How lovely you look this evening. Every conversation in the room died as nobles turned to stare. Mira felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, but she kept her chin high and her steps steady as she approached the table. Your Majesty, she replied, curtsying with perfect precision. Thank you for including me in your gathering. The pleasure is entirely mine. His smile was warm and genuine, so different from the cold mask he wore in formal court. Please, take your seat. To her surprise, the chair he indicated was not at the far end of the table where she might have expected to be relegated, but halfway down on his right side, a position that spoke of favor and importance. As she settled into her seat, she caught Lady Victoria's eyes from across the table. The older woman's smile was as perfect as ever, but there was something sharp and dangerous glittering in her pale gaze. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in social warfare. Course after course of exquisite food was served, while conversations flowed around topics designed to test, trap, or exclude. The noble ladies spoke of mutual acquaintances that Mira couldn't know, referenced shared experiences she hadn't been part of, and made subtle jokes at the expense of those they deemed beneath them. But Mira had learned long ago to observe and listen, skills honed by years of being overlooked and underestimated. She watched the interplay of power and influence, noted which people deferred to whom, and began to understand the complex web of relationships that governed this glittering world. Tell me, Lady Veilheart, Lady Victoria said during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying clearly down the table. "I understand you come from the Northern Territories. How do you find palace life compared to simpler circumstances?" The question was designed to highlight Mira's humble origins, to mark her as an outsider who didn't belong among such elevated company. Several of the other guests turned to listen, their expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed amusement. Mira took a sip of wine, using the moment to gather her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "I find it fascinating, Lady Queensberry. There's so much to learn about the intricate ways people communicate meaning beyond their actual words. For instance, I would never have imagined that a simple question about someone's background could carry so many layers of intent." A few of the younger lords smiled at the neatly delivered parry, while Lady Victoria's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. But she recovered quickly, her laugh like music. "How delightfully direct you are. I suppose that's to be expected from someone unaccustomed to the subtleties of polite society." "Indeed," Mira agreed pleasantly. "I was raised to value honesty over artifice. It's a quaint provincial custom, I'm told, but I find it serves me well." This time, several of the guests exchanged glances, and Mira caught the king watching the exchange with something that looked suspiciously like pride. But the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Commander Garrett, who approached the king's chair with news that was clearly urgent. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," the commander said quietly, "but there's been another incident. Scouts have returned with disturbing reports." The king's expression grew instantly serious. "How disturbing?" 3 more villages attacked. This time there were survivors who got a clear look at the attackers. Lord Commander Garrett's voice dropped even lower. "They weren't rogues, Your Majesty. They were organized, uniformed, and they bore the mark of the Iron Claw Pack." The effect on the assembled nobles was electric. Conversations died mid-sentence as the implications sank in. The Iron Claw Pack had been exiled from the kingdom 5 years ago for their refusal to submit to royal authority. If they were mounting organized attacks on border settlements, it meant they were making a bid to reclaim territory and testing the kingdom's defenses in preparation for something larger. "Gentlemen, ladies," the king said, rising from his chair with fluid authority, "I'm afraid this dinner must be concluded early. Lord Commander Garrett and I have urgent matters to discuss." The dismissal was polite, but absolute. Guests began rising from their seats, their earlier concerns about social protocol forgotten in the face of genuine crisis. But as Mira stood to leave with the others, the king's voice stopped her. "Lady Veilheart, a moment if you please." She remained by her chair as the room emptied, aware of the curious glances cast her way by departing nobles. When they were alone, save for Lord Commander Garrett, who waited respectfully near the door, the king approached her with quick strides. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes searching her face with concern. "I saw Lady Victoria's little performance. I hope she didn't make the evening too unpleasant for you." The question surprised her with its gentleness. "I managed well enough, I think. More than well enough." His smile was proud and warm. "You handled her attempts to humiliate you with remarkable grace. I was impressed." "I had a good teacher," she said, thinking of Lady Sarah's advice about showing strength rather than weakness. "Did you? I'm glad to hear it." He paused, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "I wish I could walk you back to your chambers myself, but duty calls," she finished. "I understand. Do you?" His hand touched her arm briefly, the contact warm and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. "Tomorrow, assuming we get this border situation under control, we'll continue your education. There's still so much you need to learn. About court protocol? About surviving in a world that would rather see you fail than succeed." His voice grew serious. "Tonight was just the beginning, Mira. Lady Victoria and her allies will not give up so easily." As if summoned by his words, Lady Victoria herself appeared in the doorway, her perfect smile intact despite the early end to the dinner. "Your Majesty," she said with a graceful curtsy, "I do hope you'll allow me to continue my guidance of dear Lady Veilheart. There's still so much she needs to learn about proper conduct." The king's expression grew cold as winter stone. "Lady Queensberry, I appreciate your interest in Lady Veilheart's welfare, but I believe she's quite capable of learning what she needs to know without your particular style of instruction." The rebuke was delivered quietly, but its impact was unmistakable. Lady Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself with visible effort. "Of course, Your Majesty. I was merely hoping to be of service." Your service is noted and declined. The king's tone brooked no argument. Good evening, Lady Queensberry. After she left, looking for all the world as though she had been graciously dismissed rather than firmly rebuffed, the king turned back to Mira with an expression of rueful apology. I'm sorry about that. She's persistent. She sees me as a threat, Mira said quietly, but I don't understand why. I'm no competition for someone like her. The king's expression grew intense, and for a moment she thought he might say something significant, but Lord Commander Garrett cleared his throat meaningfully, and the moment passed. Get some rest, he said instead. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, and you'll need your strength to meet them. As Mira made her way back to her chambers, escorted by a young guard who treated her with careful respect, she found herself thinking not about Lady Victoria's threats or the Iron Claw Pack's attacks, but about the way the king had looked at her when he thought no one else was watching. There had been something in his eyes. Hunger, perhaps, or longing. Something that suggested Lady Victoria might not be entirely wrong about where she stood in the king's regard. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she prepared for bed and tried to make sense of everything that had happened, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be wanted by a man who had the power to reshape kingdoms, and whether she was brave enough to find out. Outside her windows, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain and wind and the kind of darkness that made even the strongest walls seem fragile. But for the first time since arriving at the palace, Mira felt ready to face whatever storms were coming. She had found her strength tonight, had discovered that she could match wits with the most dangerous predators in the kingdom, and emerge unbroken. More importantly, she had seen something in the king's eyes that suggested her instincts about him had been correct. Beneath the crown, and the power, and the carefully maintained mask of authority, was a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new tests, new attempts to break her spirit, and drive her from the protection she had been granted. But tonight, she was still standing. Tonight, she was still choosing her own path, and that was enough to build a future on. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.